Hello, I'm Suzette Field of A Curious Invitation. Welcome to the 32 Londoners podcast series. Along with Stephen Coates of Antique Beat, on May the 1st, I curated an extraordinary event on the EDF Energy London Eye. For one rotation, each of the Eye's 32 capsules was occupied by a speaker giving a talk about one of 32 significant born Londoners to a small audience. Here is Bryony Dixon on Charlie Chaplin.
So welcome to this talk on Chaplin. It's a good one to do, Chaplin, round here, because he was born just over there, in East Street in Walworth. So on the map you will see roughly, it's a very bad map, it's very out of focus, I apologise for that, but what it does show you is the three bits of this part of South London. So on the south bank of the Thames we've got Southwark, which is the really old bit, we've got Lambeth, and we've got Walworth, and then further over you get over into Old Kent Road. Now when London was first growing up, you've got all this, you've got the city down here, and you've got the beginnings of the West End up here, Parliament and Westminster obviously. And you have a little bit of stuff on this side of the water. A lot of it is market gardens. They grow asparagus and stuff like that. They wouldn't today, it's so built up, but in those days it was fields, marshes and swamps, and all the disgusting industries, all the nasty, smelly, horrible, poor stuff. When the big cholera epidemics happened, it was all down there where the real trouble started, on Jacob's Island, that some will remember from their Dickens, if you remember. Jacob's Island is where Bill Sykes came to a bad end. So Charlie Chaplin was born more or less here, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what he said. So what we're going to do really is talk about his life. It's quite nice because it's a bit like this. It's a circle. It starts in the worst kind of Dickensian poverty and ends up in the stars. The first great Hollywood megastar. He was there right at the birth of Hollywood in 1914, and he was the first big international star. So the poor lad from the streets of Walworth and Lambeth became, in 1921, the most famous man in the world, which is quite a trajectory. So we'll just see how he got there. And I'm going to read you a little bit from his memoirs. And the reason for reading from the memoirs is because it's a curious thing. When he writes his autobiography, of all the moments in his life he could have picked, he could have talked about his Oscar, he could have talked about signing his £1 million contract. He could have talked about, you know, the famous films, The Great Dictator, Modern Times. But actually what he talks about is right down there, Westminster Bridge, which is just that one there, coming across from the Houses of Parliament. And it was the second bridge to be built after London Bridge, down there. In the old days, you could only get across from that side to this side by London Bridge. So we think of the Thames as having all these bridges, and they're all actually, quite a lot of them are quite new. So this is what he says. Before Westminster Bridge was open, Kennington Road was only a bridle path. After 1750, a new road was laid down from the bridge, forming a direct link to Brighton. As a consequence, some of the houses of architectural merit fronted with iron grille balconies from which occupants could once have seen George IV coaching on his way to Brighton. By the middle of the 19th century, most of the homes had deteriorated into rooming houses and apartments. Some, however, remained inviolate and were occupied by doctors, successful merchants and vaudeville stars. This is the important bit. On Sunday morning, along the Kennington Road, one would see a smart pony and trap outside a house ready to take a vaudevillian, that's a music hall artiste, for a 10-mile drive as far as Norwood or Merton, stopping on the way back at the various pubs, the White Horse, the Horns and the Tankard in the Kennington Road. These are all things that are on the map. These are all the places where the great music hall people congregated. And these are the kind of music hall aristocracy from which Chaplin's family comes. So he goes on, as a boy of 12, I often stood out the Tankard watching the illustrious gentlemen, alike from their equestrian outfits, to enter the lounge bar where the elites of the vaudeville society met, as was their custom on Sunday, to take a final one before going home to the midday meal. How glamorous they were, dressed in checkered suits and grey bowlers, flashing their diamond rings and tie pins. So these are wealthy people who are right at the top of their tree. These are the great stars of the day. So we're a long, long time before film. So this is in about the 1890s, early 1900s. He then says that when he leaves the pub and seeing all these guys go off back to their Sunday lunch, it's like the lights have been turned out, and he then has to return to his house. And this is very poignant because the house that he goes home to is where his mother is waiting for him, and she's starving and on the verge of going insane, and it's a terrible moment in his life. So he says, yes, when the last had gone their way, it was though the sun had gone under a cloud, and I would return to a row of old derelict houses that sat off the Kennington Road. That is the one that just goes off there. It's really very, very close to us indeed. Number 3, Pownell Terrace. He would mount the rickety chairs that led to our small garret. The house was depressing, the air was foul, with stale slops and old clothes. This particular Sunday, Mother was seated, gazing out of the window. She turned and smiled weakly. The room was stifling, a little over 12 feet square, and seemed smaller because of the slanting ceiling. He then goes on to describe the room being more depressing on this particular day because Mother had for some reason neglected to tidy up. Usually it was kept clean, for she was bright, cheerful and still young, not yet 37, and could make that miserable garret glow with golden comfort. So here's this little lad. He's quite a young boy. His mother is sitting there, and the reason she's listless and hasn't tidied up is because she's starving, because they've got absolutely no money. They've been abandoned by Charles Chaplin Sr., Chaplin's dad, and so though they are in desperate straits. So Chaplin's mum is a music hall star called Lily Harley, Hannah Chaplin. His dad is Charlie Chaplin, again, very famous in his day. And when Chaplin was very, very young, they were quite well off. They lived in a very nice Georgian square called West Square. Nowadays, those probably sell for 1.5, 2 million quid. But in those days, they were all sort of flats and tenements and what have you. But they were doing quite well. Lily Harley earned £25 a week, which in those days was a fortune. And his dad earned even more and was touring the States when the parents split up, probably because she had an affair with another music hall artist, got pregnant and had yet another son. She had 3 sons, Sidney Chaplin, who was Chaplin's great friend and half-brother by some mysterious man. We're not really quite sure who he was. Neither was Sid, I don't think. Then came Charlie, who was the only legitimate one, and then she had another son called Wheeler Dryden. So I think she was we can think she was probably a bit of a, floozy, very nice word, yeah. She was a bit of a one, and Chaplin Senior was a lush and died at the age of 37, having drunk himself to death, which was easy to do if you were a music hall artiste, because you had to spend all day drinking and socialising, and you had a mad, it's like modern comedians actually who do the theatre circuit, is they have to do several shows a night, and it's brutal. So you have to go from the Canterbury, which is just behind the railway tracks. You would then go all the way over to the East End to do somewhere like Forrester's Music Hall. You would then come all the way up here to do somewhere like the Oxford, which is, if you look towards the Post Office Tower, the Oxford Music Hall was more or less where Centre Point is. Then you might do one of the big halls in Leicester Square, just over here, and then you might come and do another one back here, all in one night, and you were driven around. So that was the world that Chaplin came from. It was hard work, and it was very dodgy. One day you could be quite well off, and the next day in miserable, miserable poverty. So having reached the real low point, Sidney, his brother, and Charlie went to the workhouse. All the money ran out. There was no help from family or friends, and they went to the Lambeth workhouse over in that direction. It was the new workhouse built in the 1870s. It was a pretty horrible place. You had to be deloused when you went in there, and you were separated from your parents, and it was grim. We then got sent to an orphanage for distressed boys, and Sidney, who was already 11 years old, was sent downriver, all the way down the Thames, to the training ship Exmouth, where he was brought up as a kind of cadet on a big, old, smelly ship. And they taught him how to be a steward on an ocean liner, and that's how he made his money. And he would send money back to Charlie and Hannah so they could try and make ends meet, which was not easy. So, pretty desperate stuff. It was very grim for a while, and then at the age of 8, he goes to work. His dad gets him a job in a clog dancing troupe, which, you know, what's the worst job you've ever done? Clog dancing can't be good. But he goes all around the world. Well, he goes to Paris, I think, and he goes to all of the northern towns and clomps away on his clogs. But one of the brilliant things about this is it teaches him the art of dance, which becomes very important in his career. So weirdly, he, for the first part of his life, apart from when he's touring with the theatre, he never moves out of the area that you can see with your own eyes today. He stays in Kennington. When he gets a bit more money, he goes to a nicer house in Kennington. His ultimate ambition is to move to Brixton. Now, this might seem odd today, but in those days, Brixton was dead posh, and he got a flat with Sidney. It was their first proper grown-up flat when they had enough money, and they were extremely proud of themselves. So, different days. Now we're at the top, appropriately. You can pretty much see, you know, everything that was in his world up until he hit the big time. And he hit the big time in his teens and early 20s with a troupe run by a guy called Fred Carno. Has anyone heard of Fred Carno? He was a theatrical impresario. He was an amazing bloke, you know, the sort of Lloyd Webber of his day. And he ran whole troupes of comedians who did sketch comedy, very lively, acrobatic sketch comedy, and they would go all around theatres of London and all over the country, and indeed to America, importantly for the story. And Chaplin is an instant star because he is very, very agile. Has anyone not seen a Chaplin film? Have you seen one? Lots. You know them all by heart, I can tell. You can, okay. But he's extremely agile, and in fact, one of his first jobs down there at Foresters in the East End of London, behind those 3 tall towers in that direction, he tries to do a comedy act, and it is a disaster, and he is pelted with stuff, and quite as a youngster, and then he realises that being a comedian is just not him. And it was when he was in Paris working with Carnot that he was told by a famous French musician that actually what he was a dancer and a musician. And once he'd figured out that that was his niche, to do physical comedy, everything slotted into place. And that's when he began to develop his art. And that musician was, of all people, Claude Debussy. Odd, you know, encounter. You can't imagine Debussy going out to watch Fred Carnot's comedians, but there we are. And from there, his rise is meteoric, I think would be the word. In 1912, Carnot sends him to America with a show, well, 2 shows. There's one called The Wow Wows and one called A Night in an English Music Hall. So very appropriately, he takes a show about the music hall to America, and he later makes this into a film. While he's in America, the tour, the bit of the tour finishes, and he gets a message from a guy called Max Sennett saying, I hear good things about you, why don't you come and make some films with us in a small town near Los Angeles, which of course was Hollywood. It was barely Hollywood then, it had just become Hollywood. And he offers him so much money that Chaplin thinks it's a brilliant idea, doesn't know anything about film, thinks films are vulgar and common and a bit rubbish, but he goes for the cash. He's always worried about money. Even when he's earning millions, he's still worrying that it's going to go somewhere. So he's terrified of going back there, you know, back to 3 Pownall Terrace. 1912, he arrives in Hollywood, and, you know, the rest is history. He works for the Keystone Company, for Max Sennett. Between February and December, he makes 35 films. By the 5th film, he's already directing them himself, writing the scripts. His name is on the film. No one else's names are on the film. You've got Mabel, who's just known as Mabel because she's a girl who cares about her surname. Fatty Arbuckle, you know. But Charlie Chaplin gets his own name on and just goes bonkers from there. This is helped by the fact that it's 1914, and the one thing that they need internationally to send around the world is films to cheer people up, because they are in the trenches of the First World War. So the Chaplin films, very, very popular, go to the trenches. And there then is a thing called Chaplin mania, or Chaplinitis, which is the first big celebrity, bonkers kind of Beatlemania kind of phenomenon event. And he is known everywhere, all over the world. His image of the little tramp with the bowler hat and the cane and the baggy pants and the tight jacket becomes an icon. It's used by everybody they merchandise stuff. Sydney, who is now the elder brother, is now running the business, tries to keep a lid on merchandising, and they've actually got somebody, Aunt Kate down in Lambeth, tries to stop people using the Chaplin image on everything, I mean everything, and fails spectacularly to do so. But they do make some money out of it. And even avant-garde artists use Chaplin the Tramp as an icon. So he's famous. And then he moves from contract to contract, company to company, and becomes, just negotiates up. Every change of contract, he gets more and more and more and more money. Finally, he signs a contract for $1 million for a year's work, not too bad. And after 10 years, he suddenly gets homesick for here. Weirdly, he's living in California. He's incredibly rich. He's got girls and everything. Quite a lot of girls, actually. But that's another story. So here he is, you know, the most famous man in the world. He is mobbed everywhere he goes, and he's very tired. He has also made several films which express some sort of, not longing for old London town necessarily, but there's certainly a lot of dealing with poverty. Some of the pictures, if you get a chance to look at them, have got you know, streets that are very, very similar to streets in Lambeth, and there are, in the Kid, you see what must be the garret from 3 Pownell Terrace, you know, and this attempt with him and this little lad, played by Jackie Coogan, to create some sort of, you know, this sort of golden, comforting, loving environment in this pretty disgusting garret. And it's very touching. So he's made all those films, and then he makes The Kid in 1921, and he suddenly gets homesick, and he wants to come home to England, and he just shuts up shop. He, you know, closes up the studio and gets on a boat, and he comes to London. And when he comes to London, he is besieged. So he arrives at Waterloo, just there, and the one thing he says he most wants to see is that bridge right there. And he then is picked up by a car, and you know, it's absolutely mobbed. There are hundreds of thousands of people out there, and he's picked up, and they take him around the place, and then they go off to Kennington, and he goes and stands outside 3 Pownell Terrace, and is still besieged by kids. So it's that thing, you can never go home, of course. And yeah, there's a thing in there also that says, yeah, there's a thing in saying there he is home again, and talking about all those things about London that he loves. Coffee stalls at night, which is now, I suppose, Costa or Pret-a-Manger. It's not really very romantic, is it? You know, when he talks about the policemen and they're all so friendly. Not sure that's the case anymore. You know, and all these great musical theatres, of course, that's beginning to change. By the time he comes back, music hall is not the great mass medium of entertainment. Cinema has taken over, and he's taken over with it. So he's the biggest star of the cinema, and all of the theatres around here are turning into cinemas. Some of them become theatres again, and he played all of them. So there's the big ones in Leicester Square. There's a little pink map somewhere around which shows you all the big ones. So there's the Empire, the Alhambra, and the Palace, which is that one where the musicals always is in Cambridge Circus. There's always some Andrew Lloyd Webber thing because he owns the building. So there's an awful lot, and all the South London musicals and that direction have all turned into cinemas by the 20s. So it's the sort of end of an era. But if he hadn't gone to the States and he'd stayed here, what would have happened to him? Maybe he would have got a little bit of a better job in the West End, and he'd be going that way from there, from work to home every day, and they would have worn him out. Fred Carno would have worn him into the ground by touring him round and round the place, and he probably would have, like his dad, turned to drink and died young. But he didn't. He found this very specific talent which would only work on film. And the rest is history. He lived to a ripe old age. He came here several times. He spent a lot of time going to look at the outside of 3 Pall Mall Terrace with sort of nostalgia, I guess. He had 8 children. Many children. He married several times. Most of them were terrible mistakes. And he had a slight penchant for younger ladies, which we won't go into. And he finally fell in love with a much younger lady, Una Chaplin. Now, is anyone watching? There's a thing on Game of Thrones, anyone? You can admit it, it's all right. I watch it as well. There's another Una Chaplin, her granddaughter, who is in Game of Thrones. So she's the wife of Rob Stark. Yeah, beautiful actress, and she's also in that World War I drama on the telly. And one of his other grandsons is an acrobat artist. Again, got that fantastic physical circus dancery kind of physique, and he's very famous. He performs in London quite frequently. So it ends happily, and he ends up in Switzerland because he's kicked out of the United States for being too left-wing. So it's the McCarthy era, and they think he's a communist, which he isn't really. You know, he's just stands up for the little guys. You know, like anyone from Lambeth would. In '51, I think he came back here to do Limelight, which is his great film about the London Music Hall. Again, recurring theme. And yeah, he comes back, thinks about settling down, you know, thinks about buying that house in Brixton, and then doesn't. It's just too mental, post-war austerity. It's a miserable place, London, in the early 50s. So he heads for the nice, clean fields of Switzerland, and that's where he brings up his family. So, and there's a big museum over there now, in Vevey, I think. But yeah, I think his day had gone, really, and times are changing. Because this is right into the 60s, so, you know, things have really changed by that time. So I don't think you can get away with that kind of slapstick stuff for sure. Well, it's a weird thing. He is incredibly popular in France, in Italy, in Germany, all over Eastern Europe. The Russians think he's a god. He is a god in India, almost. They have a festival there annually and almost literally praise him. And the one place he's actually not very popular is right here. And I've never been able to quite understand it. There's a thing about, you have to be a Chaplin man or a Keaton man. The face, the icon of Chaplin is one of the most, it is the most familiar image associated with cinema, for sure. And the movies. You know, if you see the movies, you will always get Marilyn Monroe, Chaplin, and some other people. And because he's the greatest sort of rags to riches story I think we've got. He knew everybody. Gandhi. He's quite famous. He literally met everybody. He met the King, the Queen, the Prime Minister. He met Winston Churchill. He knew H.G. Wells very well. He knew everybody in Hollywood, of course. And, you know, all the leading ladies, of course, you know, the big glamorous film stars. So yeah, he knew everybody. He never met Hitler. No, he just imitated Hitler and the Great Dictator. I don't think Hitler would have liked him either. He thought he was Jewish. He wasn't Jewish, but he thought he was. So no, I don't think they would have got on very well. And he did a great film taking the piss out of him. So I think that probably was a bit of a no-no as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. 32 Londoners was sponsored by Hendrick's Gin, who created 32 unique cocktails, one for each capsule and one for each London borough. To hear more talks and for more information on 32 Londoners, go to 32londoners.com. Or, for more information on Antique Beat and A Curious Invitation and the other events we create, go to www.antiquebeat.co.uk or acuriousinvitation.com.